Welcome. Tonight, we step carefully through the marble alleys and shadowed columns of the ancient Roman world. The air is thick with incense and sewage. Echoes of sandals slap against stone. Somewhere, beneath a rusting statue of a forgotten consul, a voice rises, not in celebration, but accusation. A man stands trembling in a red-streaked tunic, scrolls clutched like broken shields. His name is being shouted by men in togas. Someone points. A coin hits the ground. And behind him, the heart of the empire turns away. Our focus is awkward, and often absurd, to understand what it meant to be Rome's worst employee. To exist not as a senator or general, but as a bureaucratic disaster, a walking clerical error. Someone who survived the empire's glory not through valour, but through sheer, baffling incompetence. Before we begin, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'd love to know where you're watching from and what time it is for you. There's something strangely beautiful about imagining all of us scattered across time zones, settling in for a story 2,000 years old. Now, dim the lights, maybe switch on a fan for that comforting background hum, and let's slip quietly into Rome, together. He was never meant to be here. That thought circled in Gaius Flavius Tertius's head as he stood before the magistrates, sweat pooling behind his ears, scrolls unravelling in his hands like paper snakes. The forum buzzed with its usual cruelty. Fruit vendors, gossiping matrons, disinterested guards, but Gaius felt every stare like a knife. The marble beneath his sandals might as well have been fire. His superior, a man whose eyebrows did most of his talking, cleared his throat. "This," he said, gesturing with one hand to the stack of contradictory mangled tax records Gaius had submitted last week, "is either treason or terminal stupidity." A few chuckles, one snort. Gaius didn't flinch. He'd heard worse from his own mother. The records in question had mistakenly reassigned a fishing village's entire population to cavalry duty and declared a temple's goat herd eligible for grain subsidies. It wasn't the first time Gaius had transcribed something wrong, misunderstood a decree, or, in one spectacular instance, used a broken wax seal to validate a document that technically declared war on Gaul. But it was apparently the last straw, and yet he hadn't always been like this. A year ago he'd been just another Roman citizen with bad shoes and worse handwriting. Now he was the laughingstock of the Department of Logistics and Resource Allocation, a title so crushingly dull it made Gaius wince every time he had to say it aloud. He had applied for a job, not infamy. He had wanted structure, routine, maybe even a path to quiet stability. What he got instead was a crash course in imperial bureaucracy, a labyrinth of scrolls, stamps, egos, and endless contradictions. Now he stood in public disgrace, his mistakes etched into stone, literally graffiti mocking him had appeared near the latrines. He wasn't a soldier, he wasn't a criminal, he was something worse in Rome's eyes, inefficient. A guard stepped forward, not to arrest him, but to gently nudge him aside. The forum was needed for a better scandal. A gladiator had insulted a consul, and already the crowd was drifting away. Gaius stood still for a moment, watching the swarm of people return to their business. He looked down at the ruined scrolls, then up at the Capitol rising in the distance. The wind picked up, scattering bits of parchment like petals from a dying empire. And just like that, he was forgotten, but not by us. Because tonight we follow the trail of one man's accidental rebellion, not through bloodshed, but bureaucracy, through papyrus, ink stains, and utterly preventable disasters. This is the tale of the Roman Empire's worst employee, and how, somehow, despite it all, he managed to leave a mark. A smudged, misspelled, but entirely unforgettable mark. Before the forum humiliation, before the paperwork fiascos and the grain scandal, Gaius Flavius Tertius had been something much less remarkable. An ordinary man born to an ordinary street in the Subura district of Rome. His family was neither poor nor powerful, lodged in that wide, forgettable band of the Roman middle. Traders, scribes, minor merchants and taxpayers who kept the empire running one ledger and loaf at a time. His father, a cobbler, had dreamed of better things for his son, something cleaner. Less leather, more laurel. So he sent Gaius to be educated by a Greek tutor who despised him. Gaius was not untalented, but neither was he particularly good at anything useful. He could read, write, and translate between Latin and Greek with a reasonable amount of effort, but he lacked sharpness. He had the sort of mind that could remember a story from 10 years ago but forget the names of 2 senators mentioned that morning. His body did not help him either, thin, narrow-shouldered, and prone to nosebleeds at the worst moments. He was not built for labour nor for the army. He had tried both, briefly. The scars on his palms from hauling bricks lasted longer than his time at the construction site, and his single week at a military training camp had ended with him fainting under his own armour during inspection. What Gaius had, however, was something the Roman world prized: availability. He wasn't in debt, he didn't owe military service, and he could write legibly enough to be mistaken for competent in a job that very few actually wanted. So when his father's cousin, an overworked mid-level official in the city's records office, mentioned a vacancy in the administrative staff, Gaius was offered the post with barely a question asked. It came with a modest stipend, access to public baths, and a terrifying stack of blank scrolls. Gaius took the job with a mix of gratitude and quiet dread. The idea of stability appealed to him. A regular wage, a clean tunic, a seat in the shade. These were luxuries most Romans worked their whole lives for. But he also knew his own tendencies, his own peculiar way of drifting in and out of focus when tasks grew repetitive. Still, it was Rome. It was the beating heart of the world. Perhaps he'd find his place in it after all. His first few days were forgettable. He was assigned to a cramped corner of the archives building, surrounded by dust and men who communicated in half-grunts and aggressive ink blotting. His duties were simple: copying decrees, logging tax receipts, and occasionally summarising reports from the provinces. Gaius was cautious and slow, double-checking every word he wrote, every name he copied, until he fell behind on assignments and was warned to either pick up the pace or pick out a new job. Trying to adapt, Gaius began rushing, and that's when the mistakes began. Minor ones at first, an inverted date here, a name slightly misspelled there. Rome, despite its grandeur, thrived on routine and expected clerical perfection. Errors, even small ones, had a way of snowballing. A single misfiled document could delay a grain shipment by days, disrupt trade routes, or, if it landed on the wrong desk, offend a provincial governor with dangerously thin skin. And so, without intending to, Gaius began building a reputation, not for malice, not even for laziness, but for a kind of quiet, relentless failure. His colleagues began to whisper his name with amusement. When something went wrong and no one knew why, they'd joke that Gaius must have touched it. He became a legend in the worst possible way, but he kept showing up day after day, hoping that tomorrow he'd finally get it right. That hope would be tested soon, and spectacularly, because buried beneath those miswritten lines and duplicated records was a mistake large enough to echo from the halls of the Senate to the starving outskirts of a Roman province. And Gaius Flavius Tertius, the most forgettable man in the empire, was about to become impossible to ignore. It began, as many ill-fated journeys do, with a favour. Not one he asked for, but one asked of him, with the kind of polite menace that makes refusal feel like a moral failing. Gaius had been minding his own business, quite literally, sweeping the stoop of his father's shop in the Subura, dodging the early morning piss buckets, when the message arrived. A boy in a too large tunic, carrying a wax tablet, muttered something about imperial records and an opening. Gaius read the note 3 times before understanding its implication. He'd been selected for government work, and not in the flattering toga-draped sense. This was grunt work, scribal support in one of the Empire's most bloated and underloved departments. To say he was chosen would be too generous. In truth, he had simply floated to the top of a very short list of literate, available men without criminal records. His name had been put forward by his father's cousin, a man named Publius who worked in municipal taxation and had all the warmth of wet marble. Publius didn't like Gaius. No one in the family particularly did, but he needed a body behind a desk, and Gaius was quiet, punctual, and had recently failed to qualify for military service due to something politely labelled respiratory fragility. The meeting was held in a dark side office of the Tabularium, the massive record-keeping fortress that loomed over the Roman Forum like a sleeping bureaucrat. Publius sat behind a table piled with clay seals, ink pots, and scrolls that smelled like mould and regret. He did not offer Gaius a seat. He simply gestured to the stack of documents and said, "Do you know how to copy without embellishment?" Gaius blinked. "Yes, I think so." Publius gave him a long look, the way one might examine a cracked amphora, and wonder whether it could still hold wine. Then he sighed. "You'll report to the Grain Requisitions Division. Your job is to transcribe allocation orders and route reports. Do not interpret. Do not question. If you are unsure of a word, write it anyway. If you lose something, find it. If you make a mistake, I won't find out from you. I'll find out from the governor of Sicilia, and by then it will be too late." It was not by any stretch an inspiring start, but Gaius, ever the optimist in small and misplaced ways, took it as a chance. He convinced himself that this job could be a stepping stone. The Empire needed scribes. Scribes became aides. Aides became trusted assistants. Trusted assistants sometimes married above their station, retired with property, and avoided dying in a ditch. He pictured himself with a tidy desk, a ring on his finger, perhaps even a small villa someday, if he kept his head down and wrote neatly. He left the meeting with a scroll of instructions and a dull ache forming behind his eyes. Outside, the city roared with its usual madness. Vendors shouting, donkeys braying, someone vomiting in an alley, while a nearby priest chanted over a cracked statue. Gaius breathed it in, uncertain whether it felt like home or exile. That night he sat by lamplight and practiced forming his letters again and again, ink smudging on his sleeves. He wasn't a fool. He knew how fragile his position was. Rome was a place of invisible wires. One mistake could snap a connection you never even knew existed. But he was determined, or at least desperate. And so, the next morning, with his tunic hastily pressed and his sandals tied too tightly, Gaius Flavius Tertius walked through the gates of the tabularium and into the machine that kept Rome's bones from crumbling. He did not know it yet, but he had just stepped into a role that would in time make him infamous. Not for brilliance, nor bravery, but for the peculiar, almost poetic consistency with which he would get things completely, absolutely wrong. The building was colder than Gaius expected. The tabularium, with its high arches and blackened windows, looked from the outside like a temple to forgotten gods. Inside, it felt like a cave stuffed with scrolls. The air smelled of dust, old leather, and something vaguely sour. An odour that Gaius would later learn came from a mixture of damp papyrus and the nervous sweat of men who could lose their livelihoods with a single smudge. His sandals echoed against the stone floor as he was led down a long hallway lined with wooden doors, each marked with faint symbols, numbers, or just the dried remains of old wax seals. His escort, a silent, miserable man who may or may not have been named Marcus, stopped at one door, grunted, and pushed it open. "Grain requisitions," he said, then vanished. The room inside was barely large enough for 2 desks, both stacked high with scrolls tied in red twine. There were ink pots, dried out or crusted over, scattered like relics from some bureaucratic war. A single narrow window looked out onto the back of a brick wall. 2 men sat inside. One was ancient and half asleep, the other young and twitching like a ferret. The younger one looked up. "You're the new one?" Gaius nodded, unsure whether to speak or salute. "I'm Lucian. That's Numerius." He gestured vaguely at the older man, who did not stir. He used to be sharp. Now he just reads the same report every day and grunts when it ends. Keeps him quiet. Gaius took a hesitant step forward. "Right," Lucian said. "You sit here. You'll copy these." He dropped a pile of scrolls on the only empty stool, which creaked ominously under the weight. "If you're not sure about something, guess. It's faster. They don't actually read most of it unless something explodes." It was not the sort of guidance Gaius had hoped for. He spent the next hour trying to make sense of the documents. The format was unfamiliar, the handwriting borderline illegible, and the terminology thick with abbreviations and references to provincial governors he had only heard of in passing. Every decree seemed to require translation into 2 different versions, one for storage in the city archives, and one for duplication and dispatch to local officials. Worse, he couldn't tell which was which. Some scrolls referenced outdated laws, others had been revised but not marked as such. He copied one report 3 times before realising it was a rejected draft. Lucian, for his part, offered no help. He was busy arguing with a messenger over whether the province of Numidia was spelled with an I or an E in its second clause. By midday, Gaius had ink on his fingers, sleeves and nose. His back ached. His stomach churned from the vinegar-spiked wine they called lunch, and he'd already managed to misplace a seal that wasn't technically his to begin with. Lucian rolled his eyes when Gaius asked about the protocol for mislabeling a grain inventory for Hispania Ulterior. "Just copy the new one and pretend the old one doesn't exist," he said, biting into a fig with a mouthful of resentment. Gaius tried to protest, but his words wilted. He felt slow, not just physically, but mentally, as if his thoughts were trying to swim upstream through a river of ink and bad Latin. By the end of the day, he had produced 5 scrolls. 3 were correct. 1 was mildly confusing. The last, he would learn a week later, had redirected 12,000 bushels of grain from a coastal city in Sicilia to a military outpost in Britannia, over 1,000 miles away. The mistake wouldn't surface for several weeks. When it did, it would spark a series of logistical headaches that would ripple all the way back to the Senate. But on that first day, all Gaius knew was exhaustion. He trudged home through the dusk-lit streets of Rome, every muscle aching, wondering how men did this day after day without going mad. He hadn't bled, hadn't fought, hadn't even spoken to more than 2 people, but he felt as if he'd been dragged behind a chariot. He collapsed into bed without undressing, scroll ink still smudged across his chin, and before sleep took him, one thought echoed again and again. "I don't belong here." Rome was not built for the faint-hearted. It was not even built for the sensible. It was a city that thrived on contradiction, on spectacle, on overwhelming the senses until you forgot what you came there to do in the first place. For Gaius Flavius Tertius, still stumbling through his early weeks as a government scribe, Rome became less a home and more a test, a daily, living trial of resilience and tolerance for absurdity. By day, it roared. Bronze-clad soldiers marched in lockstep beside beggars missing toes. Vendors shouted in a dozen dialects, selling everything from olives to questionable perfumes, while philosophers held public arguments beside overflowing sewers. The smell of baking bread mixed with horse dung, sweat and incense thick enough to sting the eyes. By the 3rd hour the sun turned the marble streets into mirrors, and the smell of the Tiber rank and ancient crept through every open doorway. Gaius walked these streets carefully, always half distracted, because Rome was not a place that forgave distraction. If a runaway cart didn't flatten you, a thief might. If neither, then someone's leaking chamber pot from an upper balcony could finish the job. But it wasn't just the chaos that wore him down, it was the pressure, the invisible hand constantly pressing at the base of his spine, whispering that he had to keep up or be trampled. Everyone seemed to be moving with purpose except him. Merchants barked prices with gladiatorial confidence. Senators were carried through the crowd like minor gods. Even the bakers had more certainty in their stride than Gaius did on his best day. He tried to mimic it, walk faster, nod knowingly at buildings he didn't recognize, but Rome had a way of seeing through you. It noticed the small panic behind your eyes, the hesitation in your step, and when it did, it pushed harder. In the office, things weren't much better. The grain division's quarters were overcrowded, the paperwork endless, and the leadership nearly invisible unless something went wrong. Then, suddenly, everyone had an opinion. Gaius learned to recognize the sound of Lucian's teeth grinding before a deadline, the short sigh that meant Numerius had forgotten his own name again, and the soft, almost tragic muttering of another new hire on his 5th mistake in an hour. There was no formal training, no manual, just old scrolls, old habits, and the understanding that if you asked too many questions, people would stop answering. He tried, desperately, to fit in. He mimicked Lucian's writing style, even the slouch he used when composing requisition summaries. He started drinking the bitter, licorice-like wine the older scribe sipped at midday, hoping it might calm his nerves or at least make the numbers blur together in a more artistic way. But it didn't help. If anything, it made him sleepier, which only made him slower, which only made Lucian angrier, which made the mistakes worse. And yet there were moments, small flickering seconds when the grandeur of Rome cut through the fog of stress. A procession of Vestal virgins passing by, robes white as starlight. A sudden burst of music from a wedding in the street below the office. The way the afternoon light poured over the forum's columns, turning them gold and ghostly at once. In those moments, Gaius felt something strange, something like pride, like awe. That he, in all his confusion and mediocrity, was a tiny gear in a monstrous, breathtaking machine. But ore has a short shelf life when you're behind on quota. At night, Rome shifted. The pressure did not fade, it simply changed shape. The streets emptied in patches and filled in others, as wine taverns lit their torches and laughter turned coarse. The rich withdrew behind walls of mosaic and perfumed slaves. The poor gathered in courtyards or curled in doorways, and Gaius, walking home with scroll dust in his lungs, often felt suspended between worlds. Not powerful enough to belong to one, not desperate enough to be swallowed by the other. He'd pass by men boasting loudly about political scandals he barely understood. Women bartering for food with coins so thin they bent in half. Priests reading omens from pigeon guts in alleyways. Rome was alive, always. Too alive, sometimes. Back in his family's insula, where the ceiling leaked and the neighbours fought through the walls, Gaius would lie awake and stare at the cracked plaster above him. Each night he promised himself tomorrow would go better, that he'd write faster, ask fewer questions, avoid spilling ink on his own tunic. But deep down he was beginning to suspect the truth, that Rome had no interest in helping anyone succeed. It only cared whether you could survive it. The scroll was nothing special, at least not to Gaius. It looked like every other document that passed across his desk that month, rolled tight, sealed with a wax stamp he barely registered, and marked in a handwriting only slightly more legible than a drunk gladiator's. He remembered holding it briefly between bites of a barley biscuit that crumbled more than it chewed. The office was loud that day. Lucian was shouting at a courier. Numerius was asleep again, and someone was laughing in the corridor about a goat being elected to a local council by mistake. Amid that chaos, Gaius did what he had done 100 times already. He filed the scroll, except he didn't. Not where it was meant to go. It should have been sent to the quartermaster's archives for Sicilia, the island province that fed half of southern Italy with its grain harvest. Instead, the scroll was mistakenly placed in a cubby reserved for surplus reports on the region of Dalmatia, far to the north and entirely dependent on its own fragile trade networks. The mistake was minor, almost microscopic, a clerical hiccup buried beneath dozens of more urgent errors, but the scroll contained final confirmation for a fleet shipment, 10 large grain vessels, already loaded, waiting in the Sicilian port of Lilybaeum for approval to depart. And so they waited, and waited. For 2 weeks the ships sat in the harbour, exposed to sun, salt and rumour. The grain began to spoil, rats took their share, dock workers grew suspicious. By the 3rd week one of the captains abandoned post and rerouted to Hispania, where prices were higher and questions fewer. It was only when a local magistrate in Sicilia wrote directly to the Forum, demanding to know whether Rome had decided to starve the mainland that the alarm was raised. Back in the grain division office, the error was discovered not with drama, but with a sigh. Lucian was combing through outdated approvals when he found the misplaced scroll. His lips curled into a sneer as he turned toward Gaius, who was at that moment copying a requisition list with the concentration of a man disarming a trap. "You filed this," Lucian said, holding the scroll like a dead mouse. Gaius blinked. Yes, I must have, but I didn't. You filed a Sicilian grain dispatch with the Dalmatian surplus logs. I thought the seal was smudged. I read the name wrong." Lucian dropped the scroll on Gaius's desk. It landed with a sound that seemed louder than it should have. "Thousands of people didn't get their food. Do you understand that?" Gaius tried to answer, but his mouth felt dry. He looked at the scroll as if it might rewrite itself. A name misread, a drawer misjudged, and suddenly the great machine of Rome had buckled just slightly, but enough to be noticed, enough to matter. The next day an emergency meeting was held 2 levels above their office. Gaius was not invited, but he could hear it. Muffled shouting, the sound of a cup being thrown, then the dreaded silence of blame taking root. When Lucian returned, he didn't speak to Gaius. He simply handed him a stack of correction scrolls and said, "Get it right this time." Word spread, as it always did. Gaius's mistake became a cautionary tale muttered at lunch by other scribes. Don't pull a Gaius. A joke, a warning, a stain. It was whispered in the corridors, chuckled over by delivery clerks, and once painfully mimicked aloud by a group of off-duty soldiers in a tavern Gaius had wandered into without thinking. He left before finishing his wine. The worst part wasn't even the humiliation. It was the weight. The realization that a single misfiled scroll could starve people he'd never meet, ripple outward across ports, villages, and bellies. Rome, for all its grandeur, was precariously balanced on paper, and paper had no soul, no pity, only procedure. Gaius began to work slower again, triple-checking names, seals, dates, but this only made him fall behind. And when he asked for help or clarification, Lucian would wave him off or glare. He had become, in the eyes of his office, something toxic. Not dangerous exactly, but unreliable. And in Rome, unreliability was indistinguishable from threat. He stopped going to the baths. He stopped speaking to the vendors who used to smile at him. At home, his mother asked why he was losing weight, and he lied. Said the job was demanding, that he was fine, but he wasn't, not really. Because he had just learned what the Roman Empire truly was. Not marble and banners, not legions and law, but 1,000 silent decisions made in backrooms by men with tired eyes and ink-stained hands. And if one of them, just one, got it wrong, then something, somewhere, would break. And this time, it had been him. There was no official initiation, no ceremony of welcome or ritual handshake when one joined the scribes of Rome. The closest thing Gaius Flavius Tertius ever received to acknowledgement was a shared loaf of flatbread passed his way on the 4th day, offered by Lucian with a grunt that might have been kindness or indigestion. In that cramped, ink-stained world of parchment and pressure, camaraderie was a fragile thing. You earned your place not through merit or conversation, but through rhythm. How seamlessly you fell into the dull heartbeat of bureaucracy. Gaius, unfortunately, had no rhythm. He tried. Gods, he tried. He showed up early, stayed late, offered to carry scrolls to distant departments, fetched wine when asked. He even laughed, too loudly, too eagerly, at Lucian's jokes about provincial governors and their supposed liaisons with donkeys. But nothing stuck. He was always the extra cup at the table, the pause in the conversation, the man others nodded at without ever really seeing. His mistakes had already begun to shape the way people regarded him, not with cruelty necessarily, but with that polite, practiced indifference Rome perfected toward those who didn't matter. The office itself was a hive of petty alliances and silent competitions. Scribes measured each other by how fast they wrote, how few corrections they made, and how rarely their names appeared on error reports. There were inside jokes about senior officials, coded phrases for botched records, and a strange ritual of tossing broken quills into a corner pot, as if to honour their service. Gaius tried to join in. He brought his own pot, smaller with a chipped rim, and placed it beside the others. No one commented. After a week, it disappeared. There was a kind of cruel poetry in the way Roman office culture mimicked the battlefield. Status was everything. Allies were useful but disposable. Mistakes were ammunition. And silence, more than speech, was how you kept your standing. Gaius, with his tendency to ask questions, to hesitate, to explain, became something of a curiosity. Not hated, just observed. Like a pigeon that wandered into a bathhouse. One afternoon, desperate to earn some measure of belonging, he brought a bundle of spiced dates from his family's vendor friend. He placed them in the break area, really just a table wedged between two cabinets, and stepped back, hoping for nods, maybe even thanks. Instead, he watched Lucian sniff one, raise an eyebrow and mutter, "Bribery? Already?" The others chuckled. Gaius smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. The dates were gone by midday. No one mentioned them again. He began studying the habits of the scribes the way a lost traveller might study the stars. He learned that Junius always started his day copying from left to right, across 2 scrolls at once, and that he hated interruptions during his 3rd cup of wine. That Crispina, the only female scribe in their sector, had memorized the entire grain code of Achaea and carried a knife in her boot. That Lucian, for all his sharpness, never submitted his own reports. He had a junior do it for him, always. These small facts gave Gaius a strange sense of control, as if by learning their patterns, he could eventually learn how to fit among them. But it never quite worked. His questions, though fewer now, still marked him. His handwriting, while neat, lacked the speed and flow of seasoned scribes, and his silences, too long, too uncertain, made people nervous. He was always slightly out of sync, like a drumbeat half a step behind the parade. There were brief moments of connection. Once, during a late-night shift, he and a younger scribe named Marcellus shared a joke about a report that had accidentally awarded a Roman bridge a land inheritance. They laughed until they cried. But by morning Marcellus was back to silence, eyes on his work, afraid perhaps of being associated too closely with failure. And then there was Numerius, the old man who once had authority, now reduced to muttering numbers and occasionally signing his name on blank scrolls out of habit. Gaius watched him closely, not out of judgment, but with a kind of fearful sympathy. Was that what became of those who didn't thrive, who slipped beneath the machinery, forgotten, half respected, half ignored, until one day they stopped coming and no one noticed? By the end of his first month, Gaius had stopped trying to be liked. He focused instead on survival, on getting just enough done to avoid notice, on keeping his head down, his voice low, and his fears quieter still. The scribes did not trust him. They may never have, but he was there, every day, like a smudge on the wall no one bothered to clean. And in Rome, sometimes that was enough. The announcement came on a windswept morning with little warning and even less ceremony. A single courier, wind-chapped and breathless, delivered the message directly into Lucian's hands. No scroll, no stamp, just words, urgently whispered. The emperor would be visiting the administrative quarter within the week. Not a formal inspection, they said, just a quiet walkthrough. A surprise visit to reconnect with the machinery of governance, whatever that meant. But every man and woman in that building knew what it really meant. Disaster in a clean tunic. The reaction in the office was immediate and in its own Roman way theatrical. Lucian snapped into motion, barking orders with the focus of a man auditioning for survival. Scrolls were reshelved, seals double-checked, broken quills replaced with new ones from locked cabinets. For the first time in months, Numerius was roused from his half-dreaming stupor and made to wash his face. The floor was swept, twice. The table Gaius worked at, a wobbly, ink-stained slab of wood that listed slightly to the left, was replaced with a sturdier version borrowed from the planning division. Every record from the past 3 weeks was reviewed, revised, or quietly burned. And in the middle of this frenzy stood Gaius, stiff with dread, trying to recall whether he had ever, at any point, filed something with a joke in the margins. He had a habit early on of writing notes to himself in the corners of reports, mostly harmless things like double-check grain figures, or ask Lucian what augmented quota actually means. But once, in a moment of exhaustion, he had scrawled, "If anyone reads this, please send wine or mercy." He had no idea where that document was. The days that followed were a blur of nervous rituals. Gaius rewrote forms he hadn't touched in weeks. He sharpened his stylus until it split, then sharpened the spare. Lucian made him practice saying his own name clearly, just in case he was spoken to. The idea that the emperor might speak to him directly caused Gaius's stomach to twist in knots so tight they felt permanent. This was a man draped in divine titles, worshipped by cities, toasted by armies. Gaius had once spilled wine on his own sandals and cried from shame. There was no universe in which he belonged in the same room as a god-emperor. On the morning of the visit, the building was cleaner than it had ever been. The windows had been washed. The scent of fresh beeswax polish still hung in the air, and someone had left a small bowl of figs by the entryway just in case. Everyone wore their best tunics. Lucian had ironed his. Even Numerius had found a brooch that wasn't rusted. Gaius wore the only decent one he had, borrowed from his father, too tight in the shoulders and just slightly the wrong shade of red. When the emperor arrived, it was quieter than expected. No trumpets, no crowd, just a cluster of advisors, a handful of guards, and the emperor himself, taller than Gaius imagined, draped in white with a fringe of gold and wearing an expression that looked like boredom fighting valiantly against disgust. He did not speak much. He nodded, occasionally smiled. Once he raised an eyebrow at a scribe's detailed notes and said, "Efficient." That scribe, a man named Titus, would later get promoted to a desk job near the capital. The rest of them, including Gaius, stood in rows and tried not to breathe too loud. But then, of course, something happened. The emperor paused near the table where Gaius was stationed. His eyes, half-lidded and unreadable, drifted over the documents. One of his advisors leaned down, pointed to a requisition scroll Gaius had prepared the day before and whispered something. The emperor tilted his head, then looked directly at Gaius. "You wrote this?" he asked, his voice smooth and low. Gaius froze. He felt his throat close. His tongue shriveled in panic. Every fibre of his being screamed to run, to disappear, to melt into the wall and never return. "Yes, Imperator," he managed, his voice cracking halfway through the second syllable. The Emperor stared a moment longer, then gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. "It's legible." And then he moved on. That was it. No punishment, no reward, just a single, faintly surprised comment from the most powerful man in the known world. After the entourage had passed and the tension broke, Lucian clapped Gaius on the back so hard he nearly knocked him over. "You survived," he said. "Barely. Don't let it go to your head." But it did. Just a little. That night Gaius sat at home, turning the Emperor's words over in his mind. It's legible. It wasn't exactly praise, but in Rome, it might as well have been poetry. For the first time in weeks, he allowed himself to believe briefly that he might be doing something right. He wasn't. But the illusion, however fleeting, was enough to keep him going. It was in the quiet spaces, the ones between tasks, between humiliations, between hours lost to ink and error, that Gaius Flavius Tertius met the man who would change everything. Not a superior, not a mentor, not anyone with a toga lined in purple or a ring kissed by the masses. No, this man wore rough wool, smelled faintly of horses, and answered to the name Felix, though he once joked that the gods had given him the name out of spite. Felix was a stable hand, not in the noble sense, no racehorses, no aristocratic connections, but one of the dozen or so workers who managed the animals used by Rome's courier system. Mules, mostly. Some battle-weary horses on temporary assignment. His job was filthy, endless, and thankless, but he did it with a strange sort of cheer, as if challenging Rome itself to break him. So far it hadn't. Their first real conversation happened by accident. Gaius, attempting to deliver a sealed requisition to the transport office, took a wrong turn and ended up ankle-deep in straw. Felix looked up from brushing a mule and smirked. "Unless you're planning to requisition manure, friend, you're in the wrong place." Gaius flushed, stammered an apology and turned to leave, but Felix called out, "Wait, you one of the paper men?" Gaius paused. Yes, I work in grain requisitions." "Thought so. You've got the shoulders of someone who's never lifted anything heavier than guilt." It wasn't meant cruelly. In fact, Felix grinned as he said it, and for the first time in days Gaius laughed. A real one too, short, awkward, but honest. From that moment on they spoke often, sometimes only in passing. Other times during Gaius's rare breaks, when he'd sneak behind the office complex to breathe air that hadn't passed through 10 layers of scroll dust. Felix would be there, feeding the animals, swearing at a stubborn mule, or carving odd little figures out of spare wood. He spoke with a bluntness that Gaius found strangely comforting. No politics, no office jargon, just the truth as it was, delivered like a kick but meant like a handshake. What made Felix valuable, beyond his humour, was his understanding of how Rome actually worked. Not the idealised empire of marble arches and noble speeches, but the daily, unglamorous grind that kept the whole thing from collapsing in on itself. He knew which officials cut corners, which roads were actually impassable despite what the maps claimed, which scribes faked their numbers, and which couriers rerouted deliveries to make a few extra coins on the side. He saw the system not as sacred, but as something alive, flawed, creaky, corrupt, and still somehow moving forward. "You think this place runs on rules?" he said once, biting into an apple so bruised it was nearly wine. "It runs on people who know when to break 'em without getting caught." Gaius absorbed it all. At first he told himself it was curiosity. Later he admitted it was survival. Felix taught him things no supervisor ever would. How to write just enough to avoid attention. How to spot a scroll forged by a bored intern. How to delay a report without anyone realising it had been delayed. These weren't noble lessons, but they were practical. And in Rome, practicality was its own kind of honour. More than that, Felix was someone who didn't judge him, who didn't see him as the office joke or the mistake machine or the guy who once rerouted emergency grain to a garrison that didn't exist anymore. He called Gaius by name, asked about his family, listened when Gaius, cautiously at first, spoke about how lost he felt, and when Gaius confessed, one foggy morning, that he wasn't sure he was meant for any of this, Felix just nodded. "Most of us aren't," he said. "We do it anyway, that's Rome." It wasn't a speech. It wasn't meant to inspire. But Gaius carried those words like armour for weeks. In a city that moved too fast, judged too harshly, and forgot you too easily, Felix was a rare thing. Someone who saw the cracks and still stuck around. A friend, not in the ceremonial sense, but in the way a well-placed stone becomes a step instead of a stumble. And in the trials to come, Gaius would need that stone more than he knew. It began with a form, simple, routine, and in theory, harmless. A provincial tax declaration from the district of Campania, stamped and sealed, awaiting summary and redistribution. Gaius had done a dozen like it before. More than a dozen, in fact. By this point in his career, if one could call it that, he had grown almost comfortable with the rhythm of bureaucratic translation. Read the figures, adjust the ratios according to imperial standards, log the results in 2 copies, and forward one to the fiscal registrar's office. He even allowed himself a quiet moment of pride. No errors in the last week, no shouting from Lucian, no cursed seals or confused provinces. Perhaps at long last he was improving. He wasn't. The Campanian document, though identical in appearance to its predecessors, carried a subtle complexity that Gaius missed entirely. It reported not just raw tax intake, but a proposed revision to the tribute system, one that required careful adjustment before being logged. The revised figures assumed the previous tax rates had been incorrectly calculated, due to a population miscount the year before. This meant Gaius's task wasn't merely to transcribe, but to interpret, recalculate and file it under a special classification, pending regional adjustment, which flagged it for oversight before implementation. Instead, he copied the new figures directly, treated them as final, and marked them as ratified and reviewed. By the time Lucian noticed, 2 weeks later, those numbers had already triggered a cascade of recalculations across multiple departments. Campania, one of the wealthiest provinces in Italy, had been mistakenly issued a double tax order based on Gaius's figures. Entire towns were notified of increased levies. Local magistrates, confused and insulted, accused each other of fraud. Farmers refused to pay, assuming a clerical scam. Merchants threatened to withhold grain shipments until the demand was rescinded. And then came the revolt. Small at first, a tax collector was locked in a cellar overnight. A local administrator had his cart overturned in a marketplace. But soon, letters poured in. Appeals, demands, threats. One governor even wrote directly to the Senate accusing the Grain Office of economic sabotage. Lucian's face when he read that letter turned a colour Gaius had never seen on a living person. "You absolute fungus," he whispered, holding the scroll at arm's length as if it might bite him. "You filed it under ratified. Did you even read the addendum?" I thought it was just a correction," Gaius said, already feeling the nausea rise in his gut. "It was a correction to a correction, you useless candle stub." The shouting attracted other scribes. Someone in the corner began whispering. Someone else coughed loudly to mask a laugh. Gaius stood frozen, humiliated, helpless, aware that no apology would undo what he'd done. This wasn't just a mix-up. This was empire-level error, one that hit the wallets of Roman citizens, and Rome, above all, took money personally. He was forced to write the apology letters himself, a dozen of them, each with precise language dictated by Lucian and carefully monitored for tone. No admitting fault, no liability, just regret for procedural miscommunication. He signed each one with a shaking hand, aware that his name would now be known not only by his colleagues, but by several very powerful men with very limited patience. After that week, something changed. He wasn't just tolerated awkwardly, he was avoided. Whispers gave way to silence. The other scribes stopped asking him to pass things, stopped eating lunch near him. Even Numerius, in his dreamlike state, seemed to lean away when Gaius entered the room. It was like working inside a glass cage. Everyone saw him. No one spoke. At home, he tried to explain it to his father. Left out the details, but mentioned the mistake. His father listened quietly, then handed him a broken sandal to repair. It was an old, unspoken ritual of penance. They didn't speak that night. And so Gaius withdrew further. He became quieter, less visible. Moved through the days like a man walking through fog. He kept his head down, his hands steady, his ink clean. But he knew, deep down, that the label had stuck. The worst part wasn't that he had made a mistake. It was that the Empire, so large, so loud, so unfeeling, had noticed and remembered. He was no longer just Gaius Flavius Tertius. He was the man who overtaxed Campania. Hope, in Rome, was not something you waited for. It was something you scavenged. Gaius Flavius Tertius had learned that the hard way. After the Campania incident, his days passed in tight mechanical repetition. He arrived before dawn, left long after sunset, spoke only when spoken to, and triple-checked everything he wrote with the desperate intensity of a man trying to erase his own shadow. He didn't expect praise. He didn't expect conversation. What he hoped for, in the smallest possible way, was invisibility. And yet, strangely, it was from that quiet that his moment came. It started with a backlog. A small avalanche of requisitions from the province of Mauritania had arrived, delayed by sea storms and poorly trained couriers. The regular clerk assigned to foreign grain tallies had fallen ill, consumed, someone joked darkly, by the very bureaucracy he served, and Lucian was too overworked to care who handled it, as long as it got done. So he dropped the bundle of scrolls on Gaius's desk without a word and walked away. For a long moment, Gaius just stared at them. The documents were complicated, more complex than most. Interwoven trade figures, fluctuating tariffs, population estimates that shifted by the season. But he understood them, or more precisely, he understood the gaps in them. They reminded him of something Felix had told him months ago, that half the grain reports from Mauritania were unreliable, because the governors there bribed their own inspectors. Numbers don't lie, Felix had said, but liars do write them down. And so, cautiously, carefully, Gaius began to cross-reference the figures, not just within the scrolls themselves, but against older records he dug up from the archives, records no one had touched in years. He found patterns, repeated inconsistencies in harvest reports, population counts that changed too conveniently, shipping logs that contradicted each other. He didn't shout about it. He didn't accuse anyone of fraud. He simply documented the discrepancies in a report of his own, attaching it to the front of the requisition packet before submitting it. He expected nothing, perhaps even punishment for overstepping. But 2 days later, Lucian came to his desk holding the report. His face was unreadable. "Where'd you learn this?" he asked, tapping the margin with one ink-stained finger. "I just compared it to the archived data," Gaius said. "The numbers weren't consistent." Lucian grunted. "That's the first time I've seen someone in this room notice something on purpose." He walked off without another word. Later that week, word came down from the overseer's office. The Mauritania documents were being flagged for audit. Gaius's report had been forwarded up the chain, quietly but deliberately. He didn't get a promotion. He didn't even get a thank you. But when he came into the office the next day, someone had left a fresh inkpot on his desk. It was small, barely used, expensive. No note, no signature, but someone had noticed. That night, for the first time in months, Gaius stopped by Felix's stables on the way home. The sun was setting, gold light brushing the rooftops. He found Felix brushing down a mule, whistling some old tavern tune that had no beginning and no end. "I didn't screw up," Gaius said. Felix looked up. "Well, don't get cocky. Rome hates that." "I found something. Real corruption. They're acting on it." Felix didn't smile exactly, but his eyes softened. "About time you pulled your head out of your scroll." Gaius laughed. A real whole laugh. It echoed against the stone and straw and mule breath like music. He still wasn't trusted. He still wasn't popular. But for the first time, he felt competent. Not exceptional. Not heroic. Just capable. And in the Empire of Rome, where the smallest mistake could echo across provinces, that feeling was as rare as silver in a beggar's hand. It wouldn't last, of course. But for that moment, that one flicker of affirmation, Gaius stood a little straighter as he walked home. Not proud exactly, but not afraid either. Her name was Livia. No one quite knew where she'd come from. She'd simply appeared one morning behind a desk in the accounts annex, sleeves rolled to her elbows, stylus already in hand. Unlike most newcomers, she didn't ask questions. She didn't hesitate or fumble with the ink. She worked with quiet, measured confidence. Her script neat, sharp, and fast. So fast it made other scribes glance sideways in envy. Gaius noticed her immediately. Not because she was beautiful, though she was in a way that didn't try to be. It was the way she didn't seem afraid of Rome, not the building, not the work, not the people. That made her a mystery, and Gaius, for reasons he couldn't explain even to himself, felt drawn to that mystery like moth to flame. At first they didn't speak. Their desks weren't close, their assignments rarely overlapped, but once, during a particularly long afternoon of inventory sorting, she caught him muttering under his breath as he tried to decode a shipment log from Gaul. She glanced up. "You're reading that backward." Gaius blinked, startled. "Am I?" She nodded once. "It's Gallic shorthand. The notary must have trained in Massilia. They write from the end forward to prevent tampering." He looked again, and sure enough, everything made sense in reverse. He felt a flush rise to his cheeks. "Thank you." Livia just shrugged. "Happens." From that small moment something began. Not quickly, not dramatically, but in brief exchanges, in glances, in shared frustration over incomprehensible scrolls and broken wax seals. Gaius learned that she'd worked in the port offices before this post, that she was the daughter of a freedwoman, and that she never drank wine during the day. "Too many people reveal too many things when they think no one's listening," she said. He found excuses to pass by her desk, to ask questions he already half knew the answers to. She didn't mock him, didn't praise him either, but once, when he got a scroll exactly right, rare praise from Lucian included, she looked up and said, "Well done, Tertius." It was the first time he'd heard his name spoken like that in months. Of course, in Rome, nothing escaped notice for long. By the third week, someone had started calling her Gaius's tutor. Jokes followed. Not cruel ones, but enough to make Gaius's ears burn. He tried to distance himself after that, terrified of giving her a reputation she hadn't asked for. Livia, for her part, said nothing about the gossip. But the next time he passed her in the corridor, she raised one eyebrow and said, "You're not very good at pretending you don't see people." He blurted an apology. She waved it away. "Just don't let them decide who you speak to." They never kissed, never held hands. Rome was not kind to those who let affection slip into public view, especially among low-ranking officials. But they had their own language. A glance across the archive shelves, a shared fig from the same basket, a quick note left on the edge of his desk. "Don't forget the addendum on requisition forms. They'll burn you for it." One night, very late, after a long shift preparing emergency winter provisions, they were the last two in the office. The lamps burned low, casting everything in flickering amber. He looked up from his scroll and found her watching him, not intensely, but with a kind of quiet recognition, noticing the effort, the exhaustion, the fact that, despite everything, he was still there. "You're not what they say you are," she said softly. Gaius didn't know how to answer. He wanted to say something clever, something memorable, but instead he just nodded. Neither of them mentioned it again. The next day she was reassigned, promoted most likely to a position close to the Capitol Records Centre. Gaius never asked why. He just noticed the empty desk and tried not to look at it too often. But even months later, in the depths of his worst days, he would remember her voice, steady and dry, correcting his mistakes without cruelty. He would remember her calm, her precision, and her quiet refusal to let the city reshape her. And in the Empire of Rome, that counted as a kind of love. The kind you didn't name because naming it would make it vanish. It started with a smell, faint but unmistakable, charred parchment and melting wax. Gaius noticed it just after midday, while bent over a scroll detailing barley rations for a provincial outpost. At first he thought someone had spilled lamp oil or perhaps knocked over a candle. The scribes were always careless with flames, lighting wicks with one hand while copying figures with the other. He even glanced toward Lucian's desk, expecting to see the usual scowl and smouldering taper. But Lucian wasn't at his desk. Neither was Numerius. The office was quieter than usual. Then came the shouts. Not panicked, not yet, but urgent. Running feet. The thud of something heavy falling. Gaius stood, half dazed from hours of calculations, and followed the sound toward the main hall. When he opened the door, heat struck his face like a hand. The corridor beyond was thick with smoke, and somewhere in the distance someone screamed. It wasn't a full-blown blaze, not at first, just a fire that had started in the Southern Archives, an ancient wing filled with records so old no one read them, but no one dared throw them away. A single tipped oil lamp perhaps, a dropped ember. No one knew for sure. but the paper, stacked high and dry as tinder, ignited like it had been waiting centuries to burn. Within minutes it had spread. The flames licked up walls, curling scrolls into blackened petals. Smoke poured into adjoining chambers, filling lungs, staining marble with soot. The scribes scattered, some to help, some to save files, some to simply run. Gaius didn't move at first. He stood in the doorway, watching the far wall of the corridor flicker orange, hypnotized by the way the fire danced. Then someone shoved him hard from behind. "Move!" It was Felix, face streaked with sweat and ash, a rag covering his mouth. "This whole floor's going if it catches the roof!" Gaius stumbled, nodded, and followed him. Together they joined a frantic procession of workers forming a desperate bucket line. Passing sloshing clay pots from the atrium fountain to the fire line. It was futile, everyone knew it, but no one stopped. Rome didn't have fire brigades the way modern cities do, just neighbours, workers, slaves, and luck. By late afternoon the fire was finally contained, but the damage was done. 2 archive rooms were reduced to cinders. Dozens of documents, trade agreements, land grants, military supply logs were lost forever. Among them were several scrolls Gaius had filed personally, including the recently amended requisitions for the Mauritania audit. He felt sick when he realised it, as if part of his own mind had burned with them. In the aftermath, blame moved faster than the smoke. Some said the fire was an accident, others whispered sabotage. Too many records had disappeared at once, too conveniently. A scribe named Varro accused a rival department of arson. Lucian, red-eyed and rasping, ordered every remaining clerk to rewrite what they could from memory. Gaius did his best. He pieced together fragments of past work, guessing at quantities, rewriting supply logs by instinct and faint recollection. For hours he sat in the smoky remains of his desk, fingers blackened with soot trying to conjure order from loss. Then he made the mistake, and it was small. Another of those barely visible errors that would spiral. In his hurry, his exhaustion, and the haze of smoke still thick in his lungs, he duplicated a requisition list meant for a military outpost and misfiled it under civil distribution. The result? A shipment of armour and weapons was rerouted to a village expecting winter grain. No one noticed. Not yet. But they would. That night, Rome still smouldered in places. The scent of burned vellum lingered like a ghost in every corner of the complex. Gaius walked home alone, his tunic stained, his arms aching, his mind hollow. He passed a group of children playing with bits of scorched parchment, mock swords, makeshift banners. They waved them and shouted the names of generals they didn't understand. Gaius didn't stop. He didn't speak. He just walked. He had survived the fire, yes, but what it took with it, and what it left behind, would burn in him far longer than the flames ever did. If Rome had mastered anything beyond conquest, it was the art of blame. The city knew how to find it, shape it, parade it, and sacrifice it with ceremonial efficiency. So when the fires died down and the losses were counted, when the missing scrolls, the duplicate orders, the misrouted equipment all began to echo into different corners of the empire, someone had to pay. Not with coin, with reputation. And in Rome, reputation was currency more volatile than any minted silver. The investigation came quickly. Too quickly. There was no time for calm review or measured questioning. The Senate didn't care about clerical nuance or procedural context. They cared about optics, how something looked, how it might be spun. The loss of archived records, especially those related to military provisioning, was not a bureaucratic inconvenience. It was, officially, a security breach, which meant someone, somewhere, had to be guilty. A tribunal was formed. Not a grand affair, but a panel of tightly wound administrators with sharp eyes and dull smiles. They set up in a side chamber near the tabularium. Cold stone walls, no windows, just a desk, a bench, and 3 men who all seemed to be chewing the same invisible lemon. Gaius was called first. That alone told him everything. He stood before them, hands clasped, heart pounding, trying to keep his voice steady as they asked questions in clipped, precise tones. Had he been present when the fire began? Had he filed any documents in the days leading up to it? Could he confirm the location of a requisition form 117-A? Did he at any point allow unauthorized persons access to archived material? "I don't know," he said more than once. "I may have..." "May have," repeated one of the men, voice like dry sand. "So no certainty." "No, Dominus." They noted that. Lucian was called in next. Gaius wasn't present, but he heard whispers later that Lucian had redirected blame subtly, that he referenced clerks of questionable competence, that he provided quietly and with great regret a list of recent filing errors. Gaius's name was on it, more than once. Within the week, a narrative began to form, not officially stated but unmistakably sculpted. Gaius, already infamous for past blunders, was an easy target. The scribe who once redirected grain to the wrong continent. The man whose clerical errors triggered a tax revolt. A fire? A misfiled requisition? It wasn't even a stretch. He wasn't arrested. He wasn't flogged. Rome didn't always need violence to destroy someone. It simply needed consensus, and that began to harden around him like drying plaster. The office changed. Colleagues stopped meeting his gaze. Junius, who once shared figs with him, now left the break area when he entered. Scrolls were handed to him more abruptly with fewer words. Lucian stopped speaking to him altogether. Neither praise nor punishment, just erasure. Even Felix, when they met at the edge of the courier stables, looked at him with something quieter than usual. Not judgment, not pity, something more like sadness. "They're pinning it on you?" he asked. Gaius nodded. Not formally, but yes. Felix chewed the inside of his cheek, then spat into the straw. They always need a clean ending. Doesn't matter if it's true, just tidy. Gaius didn't respond. He felt hollowed out, like one of those statues that looked solid but was really just plaster painted to resemble marble. In time, a verdict was delivered, not by trial but by transfer. He was not dismissed. Dismissal would imply the error had been the system's fault for hiring him. Instead, he was reassigned. A post outside the city, a clerical station on the edge of the Empire's map. Somewhere quiet, they said. Somewhere stable. Somewhere far. It wasn't exile, but it felt like it. And as he packed his few belongings, his writing tools, his worn sandals, the one tunic Livia once said almost suited him, he realised what Rome had done. It hadn't destroyed him, it had simply moved him out of sight. The city kept spinning, and in its shadow, Gaius Flavius Tertius became just another whisper. It wasn't a real trial, not in the formal, toga-draped sense. No defence attorney, no dramatic orations, no audience pounding their fists for justice. But for Gaius Flavius Tertius, it might as well have been. Rome didn't need courtroom drama to render judgment. It preferred something quieter, more efficient, an administrative inquisition, staged with all the warmth of a wet rope. The summons came on a damp morning, a thin tablet hand-delivered by a boy who didn't meet his eyes. The message was simple: appear in the records tribunal chamber by the 3rd hour. No explanation, no accusation. Just the formality of his presence, requested like someone inviting him to his own burial. He arrived early, not out of eagerness, out of fear. The tribunal chamber was cold and narrow, its walls lined with faded busts of men who had all, at one time or another, been declared too important to forget. The irony wasn't lost on Gaius. He sat on the stone bench, alone, hands folded neatly over his lap, like a student awaiting correction. When the panel entered, 3 mid-tier officials wrapped in administrative authority and the vague aroma of spiced oil, they didn't greet him. They didn't sit either. They simply stood, reading from scrolls, asking questions in monotone bursts. "State your name." "Gaius Flavius Tertius." "Occupation?" "Clerk, Grain Requisitions Division." "Do you acknowledge responsibility for the errors linked to the Mauritania audit loss?" No. I filed the report, but Do you acknowledge being present during the fire that consumed archive chambers D and E?" "Yes, but..." "Were you aware of misfiled requisitions for regional military outfitting?" "I didn't file that one. No records suggest anyone else had access." And on it went. They asked questions he couldn't answer. Questions about scrolls he hadn't touched, about orders routed through departments he'd never entered. Each time he tried to explain, they interrupted. Not cruelly, just efficiently. As though the story had already been written, and they were simply checking boxes. At one point, Gaius tried to speak in full about the chaotic conditions, the fire, the collapse of oversight, the way no one trained new clerks, the layers of rot that stacked higher than any individual error. The lead official raised a hand, gently but decisively. "We are not reviewing the systemic integrity of the administrative structure, Tertius. We are reviewing your role in a deviation from expected standards." He felt it in that moment, the futility, that no amount of context could outweigh the convenience of blaming a minor man. Rome, like all empires, did not punish the most responsible. It punished the least protected. The verdict came wrapped in formal language: a transfer. Administrative reassignment to frontier logistical support in Pannonia. Not exile, not disgrace, just away. Far from the capital, far from the forum, far from anyone who might remember his name. "You may collect your seal from the vestibule clerk," one of them said, already turning back to a new scroll. "Dismissed." He stood, bowed clumsily, and walked out. There was no crowd outside, no one waiting to console or condemn him. The city moved on as if nothing had happened. Fruit vendors called out prices, children chased dogs, a beggar played a reed pipe beneath a broken column. Rome was always too busy to notice when a man disappeared. That evening, Gaius returned to his family's insula and packed what little he owned. His father didn't speak. His mother offered a small loaf of bread for the road. He slept poorly and left before dawn. And as he walked through the quiet streets, past the temples, the shuttered bathhouses, the gates, he did not feel anger. He did not feel shame. He felt relief, because the trial was never really about him. It was about Rome and how it handled discomfort. It smoothed over its bruises with bureaucratic balm, wrote off its failings with elegant script, and filed its embarrassments far enough away that no one would trip over them. He was, in the end, simply a file, closed, stamped, and shelved. They didn't call it exile. The word never appeared on any document, no magistrate uttered it, and no stamp marked his departure scrolls with anything harsher than administrative relocation. But when Gaius Flavius Tertius stepped onto the wagon bound north, packed between crates of papyrus, dried lentils, and a coughing civil engineer from the sanitation office, he knew the truth. He was being sent away, politely, quietly, but fully discarded. Rome no longer had use for him, and so, as it often did, it swept its misfit sons toward the edges of the map. His destination was a small supply post in the province of Pannonia, nestled between mist-choked forests and the sluggish curves of the Danube. Officially, he was to assist in streamlining requisition protocols for frontier forts. Unofficially, it was the kind of posting reserved for those Rome wanted to forget but didn't want to bury. It was punishment disguised as opportunity, a career cul-de-sac from which few ever returned, and fewer still returned unchanged. The journey took 2 weeks. The roads grew worse by the day, the inns colder, the meals simpler, the language increasingly foreign. Fellow travellers offered no warmth. Some nodded politely, others didn't bother. The further they went, the less anyone cared what a man had done in the capital. Rome was a long way off, both in miles and in memory. He arrived on a fog-drenched morning. The outpost was little more than a wooden barricade, a cluster of stone huts, and a low tower from which a sleepy guard watched the tree line with detached interest. There were soldiers, yes, but few. Mostly auxiliaries, hardened by weather more than war. The administrative building, such as it was, had a door that hung crooked and a roof that wept into tin buckets when the wind blew hard. Gaius reported in. The officer in charge, a weathered man named Decimus, looked him up and down with the practiced disinterest of someone who had seen 100 like him, and didn't care to remember a single one. "You'll be helping with requisition reports and inventory consolidation," he said. "Don't get fancy, just write what you're told. You'll share quarters with the surveyor. He smells like fish." There was no ceremony, no training, just a stack of reports, a dull iron stylus, and a chair that wobbled. The first days passed in a daze. Gaius copied numbers, filed names, logged the distribution of winter cloaks and pickaxes and jars of preserved figs. He didn't ask questions. No one cared if he had any. The silence suited him at first. After the noise of Rome, the constant eyes, the whispers, the judgment, this isolation felt almost medicinal. Here, his name meant nothing. Here, no one mocked him, no one blamed him. He was just a clerk, not the worst, not anything special, just one more ink-stained functionary, forgotten by the world. And yet, that forgetting stung in ways he hadn't expected. Rome had been cruel, yes, but it had seen him. For better or worse, he had mattered, if only briefly. Out here, he could vanish entirely. Some days he caught himself wondering whether he had, whether he was in some obscure way already dead, a ghost in a tunic scratching numbers into paper that no one would ever read. Still, he worked. He got faster, more accurate. The soldiers came to appreciate his diligence, if not his company. Decimus, once dismissive, now nodded when Gaius entered the room. And there were small comforts. The smell of pine in the morning, the way the mist rolled over the hills like a blessing, the crackle of fire in the barracks at night. He even laughed once or twice. But exile, real exile, is not just a matter of distance. It is a hollowing, a slow separation from the world you once believed in, from your own name, from your sense of place in history. Gaius had dreamed of rising in the ranks. He had imagined a quiet life of routine, of scrolls and safety. Instead, he had been swallowed by a system that didn't know how to teach, only how to punish. And yet in the quiet of Pannonia he found a strange kind of peace. Not triumph, not absolution, but something like stillness. He was far from Rome, and for the first time that didn't feel like a sentence. It felt like escape. He didn't look back when he left. Not really. The road out of Rome curved too quickly, and by the time the city might have come into view behind him, the wagon's canvas flap had already settled, fluttering gently in the morning breeze. But Gaius Flavius Tertius didn't need to see it. He knew every inch of Rome by feel, the rhythm of its stone beneath his sandals, the weight of its air thick with smoke and ambition. He had memorized it long ago. He carried it with him, whether he wanted to or not. There was no farewell ceremony, no final scroll to sign. His name was quietly removed from the roster. A desk once marked with ink blots and dull metal stamps was scrubbed and reassigned. Someone else would sit there now, writing over the ghost of his failures. In a city obsessed with continuity, forgetting was its most practiced art. As the wagon creaked north, Gaius kept his eyes on the hills. Rome wasn't eternal because it refused to fall. It was eternal because it knew how to shed the people it didn't need. He wasn't bitter, not anymore. That had burned off somewhere in the long months of shame, of self-loathing, of watching his reputation shrink to a shrug. What remained now was something colder, and somehow easier to live with. Detachment. Rome would go on, with or without him. Probably better without. In the final hours before his departure, he had walked the streets one last time, not to say goodbye, but to remember them properly, without the haze of panic or fatigue. He stood on the Capitoline Hill and watched the Forum hum beneath him, a living diorama of power and chaos. He walked past the bakery where he once spent 2 hours counting receipts for grain allocations, past the stable where Felix had taught him more about truth than any supervisor ever had. He paused outside the tabularium, the great stone heart of Rome's record-keeping, and stared at its walls, pitted, weathered, unfeeling. It had taken his mistakes, swallowed them, and moved on without a hiccup. There was no poetry in the parting, just a slow exhale. The city didn't mourn him, but it had changed him. Not by teaching him anything noble, Rome rarely bothered with that, but by forcing him to survive. To watch his illusions about order, competence, and justice burn away, leaving behind something simpler, clearer. He knew now that Rome wasn't a city of gods or glory. It was a mechanism, one built to grind and shine at the same time. Beautiful from a distance, unbearable up close. It lifted a few, it crushed many. Most, like him, were simply processed. As the wagon wheels jolted over uneven stones and the skyline disappeared behind a grove of cypress, Gaius allowed himself a single moment of honesty. He missed it. Not the humiliation, not the endless scrawl of misfiled reports, but the idea of it, the dream of meaning, the foolish, golden promise that somewhere inside the Empire, a place existed for people like him. Careful, honest, ordinary. Now he knew better, but knowledge came with its own peace, the kind born not from triumph, but from survival. He pulled his cloak tighter and let the wind carry the last scent of the city away. He would not see Rome again, and if he did, it would not know him. That was the way of it. Rome did not love, it did not hate, It endured, and now so would he. Pannonia was colder than he expected, not just in weather, though the wind off the Danube bit through even the thickest cloaks, but in its silence. The kind of silence that came from space, wide, forested, unconcerned. Out here the empire felt smaller and life felt heavier in the hands. There were no marble arches, no bustling forums, no political games whispered through corridors. There was just mud, pine, smoke from hearth fires, and the long breath of winter stretching across the hills. For the first few weeks, Gaius Flavius Tertius did little but observe. He watched how the soldiers moved, not with ceremony, but with muscle memory. How the locals bartered not with coin, but with favours and goats. How the clerks here spoke plainly, without ornament or fear of being overheard. They didn't care about the Senate. They didn't care who had insulted whom in the forum. They cared about the state of the road, the reliability of the grain, and whether the next caravan would bring salt. And slowly, against every instinct he'd carried from Rome, Gaius adjusted. He learned to listen more than he spoke. He learned that in the provinces speed mattered more than perfection. A half-right requisition delivered on time was worth more than a flawless one that arrived late. He no longer triple-checked his numbers out of fear. He checked them because he didn't want someone to freeze waiting for supplies he'd forgotten to send. His handwriting changed, sharper, more confident. His Latin grew leaner, his habits steadier. The local quartermaster, a man named Veturius with a laugh like a shovel scraping rock, took a liking to him. "You're not fast," Veturius said once, "but you're careful. Careful gets people through winter." That was the closest thing to a compliment Gaius had received in years. He began to feel useful again, not admired, not exalted, but needed. And in that quiet usefulness, something long dormant began to stir. Pride, perhaps, or simply peace. Evenings were quiet. He shared a hut with a veteran who brewed his own vinegar and snored like a collapsing amphitheatre. They spoke rarely, but they played dice together on cold nights, and once even shared a bottle of honeyed wine brought in from Noricum. Gaius grew stronger, not from training, but from walking, hauling, surviving. His hands developed calluses from opening crates. His shoulders no longer slouched from shame, but steadied from repetition. There was no one to impress, no ranks to climb, no tribunes looking to deflect blame. Just work that mattered because someone would feel its absence if it went undone. He even wrote letters again, never sent but written. Pages filled with reflections, memories of Rome, sketches of people he would likely never see again. Felix, Livia, even Lucian. Not in anger, just as records. The way a clerk might document the passing of seasons. By the time his second winter came, the outpost felt less like exile and more like reality. Rome became a distant place, a city that once loomed large in his mind but now flickered like a myth. He no longer wondered what would have happened if he'd filed that scroll correctly, or if he'd spoken up at the tribunal. Those were questions for a younger man. He was older now, not in years, but in stillness. One morning, standing at the edge of the supply yard, watching the sunrise melt frost from the wagon wheels, Gaius realised something strange. He didn't want to go back. Not ever, because here, in this quiet corner of the empire, he had found something Rome had never given him. Not glory, not promotion, not even respect, but dignity. The slow, steady dignity of doing something small, well, and for someone other than himself. And that in its own way was enough. It arrived on a Tuesday, the kind of day that didn't usually hold surprises. Grey sky, wet ground, a broken wheel on the grain cart, and a clerk complaining about spoiled lentils. Gaius Flavius Tertius had just finished tallying supply ledgers when a rider approached from the east road, mud-splashed and squinting from the cold. He dismounted slowly, stretched like a man who hadn't slept well in days, and handed Gaius a folded letter sealed in rough brown wax. "For you," he said, already turning to tend to his horse. "Came from the capital routes. Took them long enough to find you." Gaius stared at it. The seal wasn't imperial. It bore no senatorial markings, no house insignia. Just a faint press. 2 initials, too smudged to decipher. He hadn't received a letter in months. Not since leaving Rome. Not since Rome had left him. He opened it slowly, careful not to tear the brittle parchment. The script inside was unfamiliar, but formal, measured. It took him a few lines to realise what it was. A memo. A bureaucratic report summary. But not just any summary. It concerned an internal review conducted by the New Grain Oversight Commission, part of a reform effort initiated by a senator trying to clean up provincial corruption. The memo referenced a case, a minor but noteworthy error in the Mauritania trade chain, uncovered some time ago and flagged by an internal report written by one Gaius Tertius. The Commission had used the report as the basis for a broader investigation. That investigation had led to the dismissal of 2 corrupt officials and the recovery of thousands of denarii in lost revenue. Toward the end of the letter was a note. While the original author of the report is no longer stationed in Rome, their diligence played a part in a matter of significant consequence. This office acknowledges the contribution. May it be noted in record. There was no signature, no seal, just that small nod, tucked at the end of a memo like a footnote, barely louder than silence. Gaius read it 3 times, not out of disbelief, but to make it real. Then he folded it and placed it inside the one drawer he kept locked, beside a small bundle of letters he'd never sent. He didn't tell anyone about the message, not that day, not for many days after. It didn't feel like news that needed sharing. It was too soft for boasting, too late for redemption. But in the quiet of his quarters, he let himself sit with it, let himself imagine for just a moment that maybe, just maybe, something he had done mattered after all. Not in the way he'd once hoped, not in marble or memory, but in the way that only a true clerk could understand. A line, correctly written, placed in the right place, read by the right person, at the right time. It hadn't saved his career, it hadn't saved his name, but perhaps in some small bureaucratic miracle, it had helped someone else. That night, as the wind scraped at the shutters and the fire cracked in the hearth, Gaius sat by his writing desk, not to record requisitions, but to write one line in a fresh notebook he kept for thoughts that didn't belong to the Empire. Sometimes the work does reach beyond the scroll. He smiled, and for once it felt true. Gaius Flavius Tertius died with no statue, no epitaph, no son to carry on his name. He left behind no great works, no stirring speeches, no record of conquest or command. When he passed, peacefully, in his sleep sometime in the 2nd year of Marcus Aurelius's reign, it was noted only in a provincial census. 1 clerk, deceased. No dependents. Rome did not mourn him. Rome in fact did not remember him, but history did. Not because of glory, because of ink. Somewhere, centuries later, in the ruins of a collapsed archive beneath layers of earth and time, a scroll bearing his handwriting was found. Not the famous Mauritania report, not the one that had once caused a ripple in policy, but something smaller. A requisition log, boring, precise, signed in faded Latin at the bottom with a neat G.F. Tertius. It was preserved by accident. The scroll had fallen behind a shelf, wedged between stone and plaster during a mild earthquake that no one bothered to record. There it remained, untouched by fire or mould, until unearthed by archaeologists who didn't know the name but noted the script. Clear, careful, surprisingly modern. That fragment, now kept in a museum archive, was cited in a study on Roman supply lines. A footnote mentioned the scribe's unusual consistency in record-keeping. Evidence, the scholar wrote, that not all Roman bureaucracy was as dysfunctional as it appears. Some scribes, even at the margins, took care. That was his legacy. Not glory, not infamy, but care. And in that strange, roundabout way, Gaius did what he always tried to do. He served. Not Rome as she imagined herself, but Rome as she truly was. A place held together not by emperors or armies, but by ordinary people who copied the right words onto the right scrolls and hoped, sometimes against reason, that it would make a difference. He had been the worst employee once, that was true, but he had also been one of the most honest. And history, for all its sweeping epics and grand illusions, has a strange affection for the honest ones. So tonight, if you hear the creak of old parchment, the whisper of a name too quiet for statues, you might be hearing him. Not shouting, not weeping, just writing, still writing.